Hello everyone. So today I'll be going through another game between Horowitz and Petrosian back in 1955. Alright, so the Petrosian was taking the black pieces this time round, and the game starts out with with d4, knight f6, c4, c5. That's the Bernoulli defense. d5, and then over here usually if you're more familiar with the main lines, you'll go like b5, which is the Benko gambit, or e6, which is the modern Bernoulli. A lot of theory involved. Over here, Petrosian chooses another line, which is e5, closing out the center immediately. So knight to c3, d6, e5, and then actually this pawn structure is what we call the Bernoulli defense. It's with a very close center, and if you are quite familiar with the King's Indian defense, then you will find this kind of pawn structure familiar. And yeah, usually in this kind of games for black, even though the center is very close, you do want to look at pawn breaks for counterplay, such as things like b5, things like f5, similar to the King's Indian, right? Okay, so the game continues g6, g3, bishop to g7, and then now you see that the pawn structure really does resemble a King's Indian. Bishop to g2, castles, knight ge2, and over here the intention is that black is planning to, like, eventually black will want to prepare something like knight e8 or knight h5, and then after that f5. So the idea behind knight to e2 is that instead of knight to f3, is that you want to keep this file open so that you can eventually prepare a f4 counter push if black decides to push f5 instead, right? So knight to h5, the idea here is that, okay, so black knows that he's going to push f4, sorry, and yeah, knight to h5 is just basically trying to keep f4 under control, and also you're preparing your own f5 pawn push. Castles and knight to d7, again a very common theme in this kind of pawn structure. It is possible to go for f5 immediately, but I think black doesn't really like this because Petrosian felt that after f4 takes, and then now you see the issue is that white is now staring down at this backward pawn on d6, and black would really love to get in knight to d7 and then knight to e6, which is a very natural square for the knight, but the problem is that doing so will basically hang this d6 pawn, so black needs to spend extra tempo in order to get his knight and the rest of his pieces out. So that's why he doesn't really like this move. Right, so instead, knight to d7 immediately was played so that eventually you can come to e5 if needed. Bishop to e3, f5, and now f4 does come in. So both sides are pursuing their plans as intended. Now takes, and now you see it's staring down on this pawn over here, but fortunately black comes in immediately with knight to e5, and you see why black wanted to play knight d7 instead of pushing f5 earlier on. Now taking on e5 is perfectly okay for black because he can always recapture, and then this pawn is not so easy for white to attack it. Right, queen to e2, a6. Yeah, so you see the idea behind a6 is that this, I mean, if white wants to attack this pawn, how does he do it? Right, he wants to use the knight, so the knight either goes here, which is not very possible at the moment, or he can go here, right? Which is why that's the purpose behind black pushing a6 to stop the knight from going there. Bishop to h3, trying to put some pressure on f5, discouraging a capture. Bishop to d7, developing, and e takes f5, which over here Petrosian labels it as a mistake. Reason I'll tell you the reason later, but probably from white's perspective, what he would be hoping for was the very natural looking bishop takes h5, and then captures, and then after this, knight to e4 will be very strong because first of all, now this square is available for white over here, and he can put a lot of pressure on d6. And the second intention is that anytime he might come in with knight to g4, h4, h5, and then things are starting to look very dangerous for black over here. White has a lot of has a very potential strong attack in this position. So that was what black probably was hoping for, but what he didn't expect is that black just casually recaptures over here with the pawn instead of the piece, which on first glance it looks a bit weird. Like, why would you open files in front of your king, right? And then secondly, right, this pawn is isolated, might be vulnerable to attack, but actually when you look closer at this position, you notice that actually it's not so easy for white to attack this pawn, right? I mean, unless you capture, but actually black can easily bring in defenders to defend this pawn, does queen in, and then if he does capture and then you does recapture here, you have a couple of like those isolated pawn couples which can be potentially dangerous. But I mean, what is more important over here for black is that this pawn is actually cramping up white's position. He's controlling key squares in the center. Black no longer has these squares to mount the kingside attack, so actually the king is quite safe. Also, white no longer has this, right? In contrast to the variation over here where white can put the knight on e4, which is very dangerous for black. But over here he can't, right? Because the pawn does cramps out the position over here, so he can't he can't try to target this pawn. And that is why g takes f5 was such a strong move. Okay, so how does white respond over here? Rook to e1, of course, very natural, staring down on the open file. Queen to e8. Idea is you want to come here eventually. Knight to d1, queen to g6. Yeah, so you see, white is trying to justify that this pawn is not so strong. He's trying to pile up attacks on it. Rook to e8, very natural. Queen to c2. You see all the. So at first glance, it looks like this pawn might be in trouble, but actually after black just defends very casually with queen to h5, and then you notice you have white is forced to retreat the bishop, and after the bishop goes back, then the pressure on this pawn is basically relieved, right? Then it frees up black's pieces for operation on other parts of the board. Maybe the center, maybe the king side. I mean, black even has the option of like pushing b4, right, and then going for the other pawn break, even although actually Petrosian chooses not to go for this break in the game. Instead, he goes for rook to e7. If the idea is that you want to double up on either of these files at any time, right? So it looks like he's going for a center or a kingside attack based on where all his pieces are stationed. b4. So white is trying to create counterplay on the other side of the board, and yeah, obviously if you take on b4, that will be very bad for black, because white suddenly has a very strong attack with c5. Then either you take or you push, and then after the rook comes in, then wow, suddenly white has a lot of counterplay on the queen side, and he has a lot better chances at defending the position. So instead, black chooses to defend with b6, and after takes, yeah, so the queen does get the open file, but it's not so easy for white to generate counterplay here. Okay, maybe he has this rook to come in and occupy this file, but I mean, how else is he going to bring the pieces over like this? I mean, these minor pieces are like locked away on the king side, not doing much. He have to spend quite a lot of tempo to bring them over to the other side of the board, basically. So black isn't very concerned about white's counter threats over here. He continues on with the original plan of like just doubling up the rooks, and then white does seem adamant on like trying to create counterplay on the other side of the board with knight to c2, but alas, this is not such a good move, because like, where's the knight going to go after this, right? He can come here, then what? I mean, this square is under control, this square is also under control, so honestly, the knight on c2 isn't in a very good position. Like, he can't really achieve much. Petrosian felt that what white should have considered was to just stay back on the king side and then try and defend. Let's see, after h3, the idea is that you want to stop the knight from coming in, because if the knight comes in, then the file opens up, and then it's again black has a very nice position. So h3, and after something like g6, bishop to f3, it looks like okay, it looks like white is dropping a pawn here, but then after bishop g2, suddenly you see that this queen is in danger of getting trapped. These squares are taken away. Obviously, you can't come here, and then if he moves here, then you just go back, and then I think white will be happy to have a perpetual over here, right? Yeah. So anyway, h3 wasn't played. Knight c2 was played instead, and over here, Petrosian chooses to play a5, which when I first looked at this game, I was quite surprised. Like why would you give up this square for the queen, and then like why would you give up your plans on the center and the king side, and then just suddenly go for this kind of weird looking move on the other side of the board? And actually, the explanation that was given over here is that what black wants to do is he wants to advance his pawn, he wants to kick this queen away, because the reason is that this queen is one of the few defenders of this backward c4 pawn over here, and which white is targeting. So black wants to kick away this defender so that this pawn becomes a new weakness in white's camp. And one thing I do want to highlight in this kind of games is that, even though you might have like some weaknesses on one side of the board and you want to target them, but if the enemy can defend the weakness quite well, then it will be quite hard for you to make inroads. But if you can find another weakness on the other side of the board, and then you alternate attacks on both of them, then it actually becomes very hard for the defender to defend both weaknesses at the same time. And that is what I feel black is trying to do over here. He already has this part of the board under his control, and that is why he is trying to generate some new weaknesses on the other side of the board to kind of distract white away. And then, when white is busy trying to defend the queen side, then black can go through with his plans on the king side and the center. Right. So that's why a5 was played, and finally h3 comes in, right? And Petrosian felt that white should at least have considered a4 to stop the generation of that second weakness, even though admittedly it creates this new weakness here on b5, which I think black can consider exploiting as well, like by transferring the rooks onto this file and then just invading on the other side of the board. But still, I think white should have considered that move. Anyway, h3 was played, and then black wastes no time in continuing with his plan. a4, queen to b6. For a moment, it looks like white is generating some real counterplay here, but nope. Black just calmly comes back to defend this pawn, and then after queen to a6, this is pretty much false because the c4 pawn is under threat. And yeah, so queen to a6 is pretty much false, because if you try and do things like eliminating this attacker with like bishop to e5, and then he captures, then suddenly you see that white's position is so vulnerable. Like, this pawn is going to fall, and then once the bishop vacates this square, then this entire file is under white's control. Under black's control. So, this position is pretty much hopeless for white over here, which is why he can't afford to remove this knight over here right now, and he really has no choice but to play queen to a6, which is honestly very sad for white, because you notice that this queen is just stuck on the other side of the board. It actually plays no role in the struggle later on. While in the meantime, you see black has so many pieces, they are so active, they're all going down the king side, and then this queen is just stuck on the other side of the board doing nothing. Right. Bishop to h6, trying to eliminate this defender. king to h1, Petrosian felt that he could have tried king to h2. Idea is after rook to g7, then now you just do bishop takes f5, and then when we capture, then there's a potential for the queen exchange, right? But anyway, king to h1 is played. So now takes, and now you see what happens on the king side at the center. Now the files are completely open, and it really is very dangerous for white over here because of the knight to d3. This, you really cannot stop black from invading down this file. And you notice how, again, I want to emphasize that black's pieces are so active here. They are very well coordinated. They're all in their best attacking positions. On the other hand, you see white's pieces like this bishop it just becomes a target. This knight is doing nothing. This queen is doing nothing, right? I mean, really the only useful pieces here are the rooks. And then, black's pieces are so active. The only gripe I have with black's position is that this bishop here isn't really doing much, but it is still doing a good job of like defending the queen side against any potential mischief by white's queen over here. Right. So anyway, continuing on after knight to d3, this is pretty much false. Otherwise, rook to e2 is just destructive for white. Queen to a5, black finally realizes that, white realizes that he has to bring the queen back, or at least generate some counterplay over here. Rook to e2, so yeah, the black managed just to break through onto the second rank, and I think over here he is just having an extremely advantageous position. Queen to d8, but bishop to e8 just stops everything, and again you see how you see how all of black's pieces are just so well coordinated with each other. Sorry. Bishop to f3, rook takes c2. Over here, black is just completely winning. Bishop to h3, and actually over here, black can just give a checkmate one with queen to g2. I think Petrosian didn't actually see it. He played knight to f2 instead. But anyway, that's still winning because after something like king up, then you can just go back, give another check, and then queen to g2 comes down instead. He comes down anyway, and black just wins. So actually at this stage, white just resigned because he realized that his position was completely hopeless. The black is dominating the second rank, just dominating this file. White doesn't even have this, right? Because black's attack is just too strong, right? And that is why black decided to give up in this position, right? So yeah, this was a very nice game by Petrosian, and I think it shows that generally for most of this game, it is a very close. The game itself is a very close position, kind of. Yeah, it is very close, and it's very different nature from the kind of dynamic and very attacking kind of positions that a lot of players in Singapore are very used to. But I think it is still very important to know how to play this kind of close positions where it's all about the piece maneuvering, it's about the pawn breaks, right? And I think Petrosian really does give a very good demonstration of how to handle these kind of positions. And really, if you are looking to improve your chess and know how to play different kind of positions, then you need to know how to handle this kind of positions, the close positions. Yeah. And I think Petrosian, again, he did a very good job of demonstrating how to win in this kind of pawn structures. Thank you very much for watching.